What if I told you that the thing you've been searching for, that sense of calm, that unshakable steadiness, is not something you have to find outside of yourself? What if it was already available to you right now, and the only reason you haven't accessed it yet is because nobody ever showed you how? In the chaos of modern life, most of us are running on a kind of autopilot. Something happens and we react. Someone says something and we feel it immediately, deeply, sometimes for days. A plan falls apart and we spiral. We tell ourselves this is just how life is, that being stressed and overwhelmed is the price of being engaged with the world. But that is not the truth. That is just a habit. And habits can be changed. There is a philosophy that figured this out a very long time ago, not as a weekend seminar or a self-help framework, but as a complete way of engaging with reality. That philosophy is Stoicism, and at the center of it is one of the most liberating ideas ever put into words. You may not be able to control what happens to you, but you always have control over how you respond to it. Always. Without exception. Today, we are going to walk through 10 principles drawn from that tradition. 10 practical, honest, genuinely useful ideas that you can begin applying immediately. These are not vague inspirational concepts. They are tools, sharp ones, and by the time we are done, you are going to see your daily life through a fundamentally different lens. The philosopher behind most of what we are covering today is Epictetus. His story is worth knowing. He was born into slavery. He had no freedom of movement, no legal rights, no certainty about his own future. And yet he became one of the most respected philosophical minds in all of recorded history. His teachings were so powerful that Roman emperors studied them. His ideas have outlasted the civilization that enslaved him. When Epictetus talks about maintaining inner peace, regardless of external circumstances, he is not speaking theoretically. He is speaking from experience that most of us will never have to face. So let us begin. Principle 1. Find your purpose and hold it like an anchor. Imagine you are out on the open water in a small boat. There is no land visible in any direction. There is no compass on board. The wind is strong and it keeps changing direction. How do you navigate? You cannot. Not really. You just go wherever the current takes you and you hope for the best. That is exactly what life feels like without a clear, deeply held sense of purpose. You move in whichever direction the latest pressure pushes you. You make decisions based on what is immediately urgent rather than what genuinely matters. You react to whatever is loudest rather than steering toward anything meaningful. Epictetus spoke about this often. He emphasized that a person needs to know what they are oriented toward, not just in terms of career or achievement, but in terms of character. What kind of person are you committed to being? What values are you not willing to compromise, even when compromising them would make things easier? What does a life well lived actually look like for you specifically? These are not small questions, and they are not questions most people spend serious time with. We tend to drift into our roles, our relationships, our habits, and our identities without ever consciously choosing them. Stoicism asks you to stop drifting, to choose deliberately, to decide what you stand for and then build your daily life around that decision. Here is what happens when you do. Challenges do not disappear. Life does not suddenly become smooth and obstacle-free. But the challenges change their character. Instead of feeling like attacks that are happening to you, they start feeling like relevant tests of the commitments you have already made. The difficulty is the same. Your relationship to it is completely different. A firm purpose also simplifies decisions in a way that nothing else can. When you know clearly what you value and who you are committed to becoming, a huge number of daily choices become obvious. You do not have to deliberate about whether to compromise your integrity for short-term convenience. The answer is already decided. You do not have to wonder whether a particular path is worth pursuing. You simply ask whether it moves you toward or away from the life you have chosen. This kind of clarity is not something that arrives all at once. It develops through honest, patient, sometimes uncomfortable self-reflection. It requires sitting with yourself long enough to separate what you genuinely value from what you have simply been taught to want. That distinction is harder than it sounds. but it is also one of the most worthwhile projects you will ever undertake. Once you have found your purpose, protect it. Not aggressively, not defensively, but consistently. So every day presents small opportunities to either reinforce your values or erode them. The Stoic practice is to stay awake to those opportunities and to choose, each time, in favor of the person you have decided to become. Principle 2. Take responsibility for what enters your mind. Your mind is not a passive receiver. It is an active environment, and you are responsible for what lives there. This is one of the most practical and most underappreciated insights in all of Stoic philosophy. Every piece of content you consume, every conversation you engage in, every environment you spend time in, every thought pattern you practice and reinforce, all of it shapes the quality of your inner life. Not occasionally, constantly. The mind you have today is a direct product of everything you have allowed into it over the course of your life. As most people treat this as something beyond their control. Things happen, they think, and we feel what we feel. But Epictetus was insistent on this point. He argued that our emotional responses are not automatic and unavoidable consequences of external events. They are products of our interpretations, our habits of mind, our practiced patterns of thinking, and because they are products of practice, they can be changed through practice. Guarding your mind does not mean building walls and refusing to engage with difficulty. It means exercising genuine discernment about what you give your attention to. There is a meaningful difference between engaging thoughtfully with challenging ideas and mindlessly consuming content designed to trigger outrage, anxiety, or comparison. One builds your capacity, the other drains it. Think about what you let in on a daily basis. The first thing you reach for in the morning, the conversations you spend the most time in, the media you consume before sleep. Each of these is an input that shapes your mental environment. When those inputs are consistently chaotic, negative, or designed to make you feel inadequate, your internal world reflects that. When they are thoughtfully chosen, the difference is real and measurable. This is also about the people you spend time with. Not in a cold, calculating way. But there is a simple truth here that Stoicism recognizes directly. You are influenced by the people around you. Their habits, their attitudes, their ways of seeing the world. These things transfer. Surrounding yourself with people who are honest, curious, growth-oriented, and genuinely supportive is not a luxury. It is an environmental choice that affects your inner life the way food choices affect your physical health. Practically, this principle also involves developing a regular practice of mental hygiene. Mindfulness, meditation, journaling, intentional reflection. Any practice that creates space between what happens and how you respond helps you develop what Stoicism considers essential: the ability to observe your own mind rather than simply being swept along by it. That observational capacity is the foundation of real self-governance. Guard your mind, not because you are fragile, but because your clarity and your peace are genuinely valuable. Treat them accordingly. Principle 3. Let criticism inform you without defining you. Nobody escapes criticism. Not the most capable person you know. Not the most admired public figure. Not anyone who has ever attempted something meaningful. Criticism is simply a feature of being alive and engaged with the world. The question is never whether you will face it. The question is what you will do with it when it arrives. Epictetus was clear about this. The opinions of others fall entirely within the category of things outside our control. We cannot prevent people from forming judgments. We cannot force accuracy or fairness from those who are not inclined toward it. We cannot make everyone understand our motivations or appreciate our efforts. These things are simply not available to us, and chasing them is a reliable path to frustration. What is available to us is our response. And our response to criticism can either make us more capable or less, depending on how we handle it. The first step is self-knowledge. When you have a clear understanding of your own motivations, your own values, and the reasons behind your choices, criticism from others loses much of its power to destabilize you. It may still sting. Good criticism often does. But it does not threaten your fundamental sense of who you are. because that sense is built on something more solid than other people's approval. When criticism arrives, the Stoic approach is to pause before responding, to genuinely ask whether there is anything useful here. Sometimes there is. Harsh feedback from someone who has experience you lack and genuinely wants you to improve can be among the most valuable things you ever receive. The ability to extract that value, even when the delivery is uncomfortable, is a real skill. Develop it. But sometimes criticism reflects nothing about you and everything about the person delivering it. People project their own frustrations, insecurities, and unresolved conflicts outward. Criticism that comes from that place is not really about you, even when it is addressed to you. Recognizing this does not require being dismissive or contemptuous. It simply requires accuracy. Not every criticism deserves the same weight. The Stoic ideal here is someone who is genuinely improved by feedback, but not destabilized by judgment. Someone whose sense of self is robust enough to hear difficult things without collapsing, and honest enough to genuinely consider whether those difficult things contain truth. That combination of stability and openness is exactly what Stoicism cultivates. Building a thicker skin, in the genuine sense, is a gradual process. It comes from repeated practice of exactly this: hearing criticism, pausing, evaluating honestly, taking what serves you, and releasing the rest without drama. Each time you do it, the process becomes a little more natural. Principle 4. You decide how much an offense costs. You hear is something that sounds simple but is actually profound. No one can make you feel anything without your participation. This is not a denial of the fact that painful things happen. It is a recognition of where the actual pain is generated, and it is generated inside you through the meaning you assign to events, not by the events themselves. Epictetus put this directly. He said that what disturbs us is not what happens, but our judgment about what happens. Two people can face identical circumstances and have completely different internal experiences of them. Same event, different responses. The difference is not luck or personality. It is practice. When someone says something that triggers hurt or anger in you, the immediate experience feels automatic. It feels like their words caused your reaction directly, the way a physical impact causes pain. But there is actually a step in between, and that step is interpretation. You are making meaning of what happened. You are telling yourself a story about what it means for you, about the other person's intentions, about what this says about your worth or your relationships or your future. And that story is where the real suffering lives. This is not an invitation to deny your emotions or to pretend you are unaffected when you are. It is an invitation to examine the story. Ask yourself what you are assuming. Ask whether those assumptions are accurate, or whether they are products of old patterns, sensitivities, and fears. Often, you will find that the actual event was much smaller than the narrative you built around it. Empathy helps enormously here. When someone behaves in a way that offends or hurts you, they are almost always dealing with something. Stress, frustration, their own fears, their own unhealed places. Their behavior is an expression of their internal state, and their internal state is not your responsibility to manage. Understanding this creates distance from the sting of the offense without requiring you to excuse or accept harmful treatment. Forgiveness, in the Stoic framework, is not a moral virtue you practice for the benefit of the person who hurt you. It is a practical act of self-liberation. Holding on to offense requires you to keep the wound active. It keeps your attention and your energy tied to something that is already over. Releasing it is not pretending it did not happen. It is simply choosing not to carry it forward into moments that deserve your full presence. Every time you choose to respond to offense with intention rather than reaction, you are building something real. You are developing a quality of character that protects your inner peace more effectively than any external circumstance ever could. Principle 5. Stop running from fear and shame. Fear is not the problem. Unexamined fear is the problem. The distinction matters enormously. Fear, in its basic form, is a signal. It is your mind identifying something it perceives as threatening and calling for attention. That signal is not always accurate. It is not always proportionate. but it is always worth examining. The Stoic approach is to turn toward fear rather than away from it, to engage with it directly, and in doing so, to dramatically reduce its power. The mechanics of this are straightforward. Most fear derives its intensity not from the actual threat it points to, but from the vagueness of the threat combined with avoidance of it. When you refuse to look directly at what you are afraid of, the fear grows in the darkness. It expands to fill whatever space you give it. But when you shine a clear, honest light on it, something almost always happens. It becomes smaller. Take the fear of failure in a specific area of your life. Left unexamined, it operates as a diffuse, oppressive presence that affects your decisions without you being fully aware of it. You avoid trying things. You pull back from opportunities. You tell yourself you're being practical when you are actually being afraid. But when you sit with the fear directly, when you ask what exactly you are afraid of, what the actual worst outcome looks like, how likely it is, and what you would do if it happened, the fear begins to resolve. It becomes a specific concern with specific, manageable components rather than a shapeless threat. Shame operates through a different mechanism but responds to the same approach. Shame, unlike guilt, makes a claim about identity rather than behavior. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. Stoicism rejects the second claim categorically. Your mistakes are not your identity. Your failures are not your character. They are events you can learn from and correct, and then move forward from. The Stoic path through shame involves first acknowledging it honestly rather than burying it, then examining it. Where did this belief about yourself come from? Is it accurate? Does it reflect something real that needs to be addressed? Or is it a story you absorbed from an experience or an environment that did not see you clearly? Self-forgiveness is not weakness. It is not making excuses. It is the honest recognition that you are a human being in process, that growth requires making mistakes, and that you cannot grow forward while refusing to release the past. Acknowledge what happened. Learn from it. Correct what can be corrected, and then let it go with intention. Talking honestly with people you trust is one of the most effective ways to work through both fear and shame. Bringing these things into the light of genuine relationship almost always diminishes their power. You discover that you're not as alone in your struggles as shame insists you are. Principle 6. Prepare for difficulty before it arrives. One of the most counterintuitive practices in Stoic philosophy is also one of the most practically effective. It involves deliberately imagining difficulties before they occur, not to generate anxiety, but to eliminate the extra suffering that comes from being caught completely off guard. The ancient Stoics called this practice the premeditation of adversity. The logic is precise. Surprise dramatically amplifies the impact of difficulty. When something genuinely hard happens and you had no mental preparation for it, you face two challenges simultaneously: the difficulty itself and the shock of encountering something you did not anticipate. Premeditation removes the second challenge. The difficulty may still arrive, but you have already visited it in your mind. You have already considered your response. The ground beneath you does not give way in the same way. This is not pessimism. Pessimism expects the worst and finds it everywhere. Premeditation is a targeted exercise applied before specific situations to build realistic readiness. The distinction is important. Before a high-stakes conversation, a significant presentation, or any situation you find genuinely daunting, take time to honestly imagine what could go wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but realistically wrong. What obstacles might appear? What unexpected difficulties might arise? And more importantly, how would you respond? What resources do you have available? What would you actually do? This kind of mental preparation does several things simultaneously. It reduces the power of surprise. It activates your problem-solving capacity before you need it. And it reveals something important about your own resilience. When you take inventory of your actual resources, your experience, your skills, your relationships, your past record of moving through difficulty, you typically find more there than anxiety suggested. Anticipating obstacles also cultivates a flexibility of mind that transfers across all kinds of situations. The person who regularly engages with difficulty in thought becomes more adaptable when difficulty arrives in reality. They are not rigid. They are not locked into a single plan. They can adjust. Regular reflection on past challenges deepens this capacity. Looking back at what you have already navigated, honestly examining what threatened you and what did not, builds a realistic and grounded model of your own capability. Most people, when they look back honestly, discover that they have been more resilient than they gave themselves credit for. That discovery changes your relationship with future uncertainty in ways that abstract reassurance never could. Principle 7. Real strength is built on the inside. We spend most of our lives trying to manage external circumstances. We work to secure better situations, better outcomes, or better environments, better relationships. And there is nothing wrong with that. But Stoicism identifies something that most approaches to well-being miss entirely. The quality of your inner life is not determined by your external circumstances. It is determined by your orientation toward them. Epictetus said this as plainly as it can be said. He insisted that the power to be at peace or in turmoil lies entirely within us, not in what happens to us, in how we choose to relate to what happens to us. This is not a motivational slogan. It is a claim about the actual mechanics of human experience, and it has enormous practical implications. Inner strength, understood this way, is not toughness. It is not the refusal to feel. It is not pretending that difficult things do not affect you. It is the developed capacity to experience difficulty fully and remain genuinely functional within it. That capacity is built through practice, not through luck or temperament. Self-awareness is where this practice begins. When you genuinely understand your emotional landscape, when you know what triggers you and why, when you can recognize your own patterns of reaction, you gain the ability to work with your inner life rather than simply being carried by it. You become the observer of your reactions rather than just the subject of them. That shift is significant. The Stoic distinction between what is within your control and what is not is one of the most practically useful frameworks available for managing attention and energy. Ask yourself honestly how much of your daily mental energy is directed toward things you genuinely cannot change. Other people's behavior, past events, outcomes already determined, circumstances beyond your influence. The Stoic practice is to recognize those categories clearly and redirect your attention toward what you can actually affect. Your effort, your choices, your character, your responses. This redirection is not resignation. You can still care deeply about outcomes you cannot control, but you invest your actual energy in what is actually available to you. Over time, this shift reduces a tremendous amount of unnecessary suffering. Resilience, in the truest sense, is not the absence of difficulty. It is the practiced capacity to move through difficulty without permanently losing yourself in it. Every challenge you face and come through adds to that capacity. The accumulation is real. You become, over time, someone who can genuinely say that hardship has made them more capable, not less. Gratitude reinforces all of this in ways that are easy to underestimate. A regular, genuine practice of acknowledging what is good in your life, even amid real difficulty, recalibrates your baseline in ways that make everything else more manageable. This is not about denying problems. It is about refusing to allow problems to monopolize your perception. Principle 8. Choose your actions. Rather than being compelled by them between any impulse and any action, there is a gap. In most people, that gap is almost imperceptibly small. Something happens, and a reaction follows almost immediately. An emotion rises, and behavior follows directly from it. This is the default. And the default produces a life shaped largely by habit, impulse, and circumstance, rather than by deliberate choice. Stoicism asks you to widen that gap, not to become passive or disengaged, but to become someone whose actions are genuinely chosen rather than simply triggered. This begins with awareness of your own impulses. You cannot govern what you cannot see. The practice of noticing your impulses before acting on them, of creating even a brief pause between the urge and the behavior, is the foundation of genuine self-determination. It sounds simple. Like most genuinely important things, it requires consistent practice. Consider a situation most people encounter regularly. You are in a difficult conversation. Something is said that feels unfair or dismissive, or genuinely hurtful. The impulse to respond immediately, to defend yourself, to escalate, is powerful. And sometimes immediate response is appropriate. But the Stoic question is always the same. Is this response chosen or compelled? Are you acting from your values or from the pressure of the moment? That distinction produces fundamentally different outcomes. Reactions driven by unexamined impulse tend to escalate conflict, damage relationships, and produce regret. Responses chosen deliberately, even in difficult moments, tend to move things forward. The content of the response may sometimes be identical. What changes is the quality of agency behind it. Delayed gratification is one of the most important expressions of this principle in everyday life. The ability to tolerate discomfort in the present for the sake of a better outcome in the future is one of the most reliable indicators of long-term well-being we know of. It underlies almost every meaningful form of achievement, and it is, at its core, the practice of choosing your actions rather than being compelled by immediate reward or immediate relief. This principle also applies directly to the kind of life you are building. Every day, small choices either move you toward the person you have decided to become or away from that person. Most of these choices are not dramatic. They are quiet, incremental, and easy to dismiss as insignificant, but they accumulate in one direction or the other. The Stoic practice is to remain awake to that accumulation and to choose consistently, even in the small things. Regular, honest reflection on your own behavior patterns is essential here. Not harsh self-judgment, but genuine assessment. Where did you act impulsively today? Where did you choose well? What conditions tend to make deliberate choice harder for you? This kind of self-knowledge is not abstract. It is the practical material out of which real change is made. Principle 9. Accept reality as your starting point, not your defeat. There is a form of suffering that has nothing to do with external circumstances. It is the suffering generated by the gap between how things actually are and how we insist they should be. We spend enormous energy maintaining that gap, arguing with reality in our minds, resisting what is already true, wishing for conditions that do not exist. And all of that energy produces nothing except exhaustion and sustained unhappiness. Stoic acceptance is one of the most misunderstood ideas in the entire philosophy. It is not resignation. It is not indifference. It is not passive acceptance of harm or injustice. It is something far more practical and far more powerful than any of those things. It is the recognition that action must begin from reality as it actually is, not from reality as we wish it were. When something goes genuinely wrong, when a plan fails, when a relationship ends, when a situation develops in a way you did not want, the first necessary move is honest acknowledgement. This happened. It is real. Now, what is actually available from here? That question cannot be answered honestly while you are still insisting that things should be different. Acceptance is not the end of engagement with difficulty. It is the beginning of effective engagement with it. Mindfulness supports this directly. The practice of being present with your actual experience, without layering it immediately with judgment, resistance, or narrative, develops the capacity to see things as they are, rather than through the distorting lens of how we want them to be. This clarity is genuinely useful. It allows you to respond to situations rather than to your stories about situations. Perfectionism is one of the most common obstacles to genuine acceptance. The relentless pursuit of outcomes that meet an impossible standard makes it genuinely difficult to engage authentically with the process of anything. Real growth, in any area, involves imperfect attempts, honest evaluation, adjustment, and continued effort. None of that is possible if you are waiting for conditions to be flawless before you begin, or refusing to acknowledge an imperfect outcome because acknowledging it feels like failure. Gratitude and acceptance work in close partnership. When you can genuinely see and appreciate what is already good in your current reality, you are practicing a form of presence that naturally reduces the compulsive need to have things be different. Your life, as it actually is, contains real value. Recognizing that is not settling. It is accurate. In relationships, acceptance means allowing people to be who they actually are, rather than constantly comparing them to who you want them to be. This does not mean tolerating treatment that is genuinely harmful. It means releasing the exhausting and ultimately unsuccessful project of reshaping everyone around you into a more convenient form. People are who they are. Meeting them there, rather than at the location of your expectations, creates the conditions for genuine connection. Principle 10. Build a life that reflects who you actually are. Everything we have discussed so far converges here in this final principle, which is in many ways the most encompassing of them all. Stoicism is ultimately asking you to live a life that is genuinely yours, not the life other people have designed for you, not the life your fears have permitted you, the life that flows from your actual nature, your real values, your honest understanding of what genuinely matters to you. Epictetus and the Stoic tradition consistently pointed toward this idea. They called it living according to nature. And while that phrase can sound abstract, what it means practically is straightforward. Live in alignment with your rational and social nature as a human being. Make choices that reflect genuine wisdom rather than impulsive reaction. Act with courage rather than defaulting to comfort. Treat others with justice and fairness. Maintain temperance, the capacity for balance and proportion in all things. These 4 qualities, wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, are what the Stoics called the cardinal virtues. They are not personality traits you are born with or without. They are capacities that are developed through practice, through daily choices made in the direction of who you are genuinely trying to become. Living in alignment with your actual nature requires ongoing self-knowledge, not the kind that produces endless navel-gazing, but the kind that keeps you honest about what you actually value, what choices genuinely reflect those values, and where you are allowing fear, habit, or social pressure to steer your life in directions you would not consciously choose. It also means accepting and working with the social dimension of your nature. We are not isolated creatures. The Stoic vision of a good life is not a solitary, self-sufficient one. We are connected to other people in ways that are not optional. Our well-being is genuinely bound up with the well-being of those around us. Living according to your nature means contributing meaningfully to your relationships and your community, not as an obligation, but as an expression of what you actually are. Simplicity serves this principle in an important practical way. When your life is organized around what genuinely matters to you rather than around accumulation, status, and the management of other people's impressions, clarity becomes much more accessible. Complexity obscures, simplicity reveals. The things that actually nourish you, the relationships, the meaningful work, the moments of genuine presence, tend to become clearer when the unnecessary layers are removed. Mindfulness connects all of this together in daily life. The practice of paying genuine attention to your actual experience, to the texture of the present moment, to the quality of your choices as you make them, prevents you from living your life on automatic and missing it entirely. The examined life that Stoicism advocates for is not a life of perpetual self-analysis. It is a life lived with genuine awareness, genuine intention, and genuine presence. Closing. We have covered 10 principles today. And if there is one thing I want you to carry with you from all of this, it is that Stoicism is not about becoming indifferent to life. It is about becoming capable of life, fully, honestly, and without being destroyed by the inevitable difficulty of it. These 10 principles are not a formula you apply once and then forget. They are practices. They require your consistent return. They ask you to choose again and again, Even when choosing the deliberate response is harder than choosing the reactive one. But the results of that practice accumulate in real ways. The person you become through sustained Stoic practice is someone who is genuinely more free, more capable, more at peace, and more present than the person who never discovered this path. Define your purpose and guard your mind. Receive criticism without being defined by it. Choose your response to offense. Examine your fears directly. Anticipate difficulty before it arrives. Build your strength from within. Practice intentional action. Accept reality as your starting point. And build a life that genuinely reflects who you are. This is the Stoic path. It is ancient. It has been tested by people facing conditions far more severe than most of us will ever encounter. And it works. Not because it promises you a comfortable life, but because it delivers something more valuable than comfort. The genuine capacity to face whatever arrives and remain, through all of it, essentially yourself. If this video has added something to your day, please like it and share it with someone who might need it. This channel, Stoic Zeno, is built on the belief that this kind of wisdom is not just for philosophers. It is for everyone who is willing to engage with it seriously. Subscribe if you want more content like this, and we will see you in the next one.